We spend our entire lives trying to become better versions of ourselves. We optimize our routines, we set ambitious goals, we chase achievements that promise to finally make us feel whole. Society tells us that growth means accumulation, more skills, more success, more validation from the world around us. But what if this entire approach to self-improvement is exactly what keeps you stuck in mediocrity? Nietzsche saw something most philosophers missed. He understood that true transformation doesn't come from adding more to yourself. It comes from something far more brutal. He called it self-overcoming, and it has nothing to do with the comfortable self-help narratives we've been sold. This isn't about becoming a polished version of who you already are. This is about psychological warfare with everything you've built your identity upon. Those who understood Nietzsche's lesson didn't just improve their lives, they became unrecognizable to their former selves. They didn't climb higher on the same ladder, they burned the ladder entirely. They discovered that the obstacles holding them back weren't external circumstances or lack of discipline. The obstacle was the very self they were trying to improve. And in confronting this truth, they accessed a kind of power that doesn't fit into any conventional framework. In this video, we're going to explore what Nietzsche actually meant by self-overcoming and why it terrified even him. You'll discover why your current identity is your greatest prison, how comfort becomes the enemy of transformation, and what it actually takes to break through the psychological barriers you've been reinforcing your entire life. This isn't philosophy for intellectual entertainment. This is a manual for psychological revolution. Imagine a snake trying to grow while refusing to shed its skin. It would become trapped, suffocated by the very protection that once kept it safe. The old skin that once served it now becomes a prison, constricting its movement, limiting its growth, eventually killing it. This is the human condition Nietzsche observed everywhere he looked. We cling to versions of ourselves that have long stopped serving us, terrified of the vulnerability that comes with letting them go. Nietzsche saw that most people don't actually want to transform. They want to become more comfortable versions of what they already are. They want growth without loss, power without sacrifice, evolution without death. But transformation, real transformation, requires something far more radical. It requires you to betray the person you've been telling yourself you are. It requires you to murder your most cherished beliefs about yourself. And this is why most people never change in any meaningful way. Consider the person who defines themselves by their suffering. They've built an entire identity around their wounds, their traumas, their reasons for why life is hard. Every conversation becomes a performance of pain, every relationship a stage to display their victimhood. They seek help, they read books, they attend therapy, but underneath it all, they're terrified of actually healing. Because healing would mean losing the only identity they know. It would mean confronting the terrifying question, who am I without my suffering? Or think about the person who's built their entire sense of self around being the reliable one. They sacrifice endlessly, they never say no, they pride themselves on being needed, but this identity has become a cage. They're dying inside from exhaustion and resentment, yet they can't stop, because if they stop being the person everyone depends on, who would they be? The identity that once made them feel valuable now drains every ounce of vitality from their life. But letting it go feels like psychological suicide. Nietzsche understood something about human nature that we desperately try to avoid. We don't love ourselves as much as we love our familiar suffering. We choose the known prison over the unknown freedom. We'd rather remain who we are, even if it's destroying us, than face the terrifying void of becoming something new. This isn't weakness. This is the human condition, and it's precisely what makes self-overcoming the hardest psychological task anyone can undertake. He spent years observing people who claimed they wanted to change. He watched them read philosophy, attend lectures, discuss grand ideas about human potential. But when it came to actually confronting themselves, actually dismantling the identities they'd built, they always found reasons to retreat. They'd replace one comfortable narrative with another. They'd swap one set of beliefs for a different set that made them feel superior. But they never actually overcame themselves. They just redecorated the same prison. The ones who actually transformed had a specific quality Nietzsche recognized immediately. They had stopped trying to improve themselves and started trying to overcome themselves. This distinction is everything. Improvement means becoming a better version of what you are. Overcoming means destroying what you are to become something you cannot yet imagine. Improvement is additive. Overcoming is destructive. And destruction, real destruction of the false self, requires a kind of courage most people will never access. But here's the trap most people fall into. They think change means adopting new behaviors while keeping their core identity intact. They try to meditate their way to peace while clinging to their identity. As an anxious person, they try to build confidence while maintaining their story of being damaged. They want transformation while refusing the death that transformation requires, and so they stay stuck, forever working on themselves but never actually changing in any fundamental way. Nietzsche saw that true self-overcoming begins with a brutal recognition. Everything you think makes you you is probably what's preventing you from becoming who you could be. Your strengths have become crutches. Your values have become prisons. Your identity has become a tomb. And until you're willing to smash all of it, to stand in the terrifying emptiness of not knowing who you are, you'll just keep cycling through different versions of the same limited self. The question then becomes, are you willing to wage war against yourself? Not the comfortable war of trying harder or being more disciplined. The real war, the one where you systematically dismantle every defense mechanism, every comforting narrative, every identity you've built to protect yourself from the raw reality of existence. This is what Nietzsche meant by self-overcoming, and this is where the real work begins. If this content is challenging something fundamental in how you see yourself, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Because what comes next requires us to explore not just why self-overcoming is necessary, but what it actually looks like when someone stops performing transformation and starts living it. Most people misunderstand what Nietzsche meant when he spoke about overcoming yourself because they try to make it fit into their existing framework of self-improvement. They think he's talking about willpower or discipline or becoming stronger. But Nietzsche was describing something far more radical and far more terrifying. He was talking about the death of the self you think you are and the birth of something you cannot predict or control. Nietzsche himself lived this process in the most extreme way possible. In 1889, at the age of 44, he suffered a complete mental collapse in Turin. But this wasn't a sudden break from reality. It was the culmination of years of philosophical and psychological warfare he'd been waging against himself. He had spent the previous decade systematically dismantling every comfortable belief, every social convention, every philosophical tradition that had shaped Western thought. And in doing so, he dismantled himself. Before his collapse, Nietzsche withdrew almost completely from society. He lived in small boarding houses across Europe. Nice, Turin, Sils Maria, spending his days alone, writing feverishly, thinking thoughts that terrified him even as he wrote them. He was overcoming not just his Christian upbringing, not just his academic training as a classical philologist, but the entire moral architecture that had given his life meaning. He was choosing to stand in a void of his own making. This wasn't a romantic quest for enlightenment. This was brutal, isolating, often physically painful work. Nietzsche suffered from chronic illness, terrible headaches, stomach problems, near blindness. He had no stable income, few friends, no recognition for his work. He was alone in every sense of the word. And yet he kept pushing, kept questioning, kept tearing down everything he'd built. Not because it made him happy, but because he couldn't do otherwise. He had glimpsed what lay beyond the comfortable narratives of selfhood, and there was no going back. During these years, he confronted aspects of himself that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The resentment underneath his morality, the will to power underneath his philosophy, the chaos underneath his carefully constructed identity. He didn't just think about these things abstractly. He felt them viscerally, let them consume him, allowed them to destroy his sense of who he was. He descended into psychological territories that most people would call madness. And in a sense, they were right. Think of it like this. Imagine you've built an elaborate house over the course of your life. Every room represents a belief about yourself, a value you hold, a story that gives your life meaning. Now imagine systematically going through that house and burning each room to the ground one by one until you're standing in ashes with nowhere to shelter. Most people would start rebuilding immediately, recreating something similar to what they lost. But self-overcoming means standing in those ashes and refusing to rebuild the old structure. When Nietzsche emerged from these periods of isolation, he wasn't trying to convince anyone of his ideas. He wasn't seeking validation or recognition. He had moved beyond the need for external confirmation because he'd destroyed the part of himself that needed it. The concepts he developed, the Übermensch, the eternal return, the will to power, weren't just philosophical theories. They were maps of territories he'd actually traversed in his own psyche. He understood something crucial. You cannot overcome yourself through understanding alone. You cannot think your way into transformation. You can only destroy your way into it. This means actively dismantling the psychological structures that make you feel safe, that give you identity, that allow you to predict who you are. It means choosing uncertainty over comfort, chaos over stability, becoming over being. The term self-overcoming comes from Nietzsche's concept of Selbstüberwindung. It's often mistranslated as self-improvement or self-mastery, but the German is more violent than that. Überwindung carries connotations of conquering, defeating, getting over something. It's not about managing yourself better, it's about defeating the self that needs managing. It's about making yourself obsolete. Nietzsche wrote, "Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him?" This isn't a question about personal development. This is a question about whether you've had the courage to wage war against everything you think you are. Whether you've been willing to sacrifice your most comfortable identities on the altar of becoming. Whether you've chosen the terrifying freedom of not knowing over the comforting prison of self-definition. The people who actually understand this don't talk about it in inspiring Instagram posts. They don't write best-selling memoirs about their transformation. Because real self-overcoming doesn't produce a better version of the old self. It produces something incomprehensible to who you were before. It's not linear progress, it's a complete rupture, and you can't communicate across that rupture because the language itself belongs to the old self you destroyed. Here's what this actually requires. You need to identify every story you tell about yourself and recognize it as a prison. You need to find every value you hold sacred and question whether it's actually serving your becoming or just protecting you from it. You need to locate every place you feel certain about who you are and introduce radical doubt, not because certainty is always wrong, but because certainty stops movement, and life is movement. But most people won't do this. Most people will read Nietzsche and feel inspired for a moment, then return to their comfortable narratives about themselves. They'll add self-overcoming to their identity as something they're working on, completely missing that working on yourself is different from overcoming yourself. Working on yourself assumes a self that continues. Overcoming yourself assumes a self that must die. And death, even psychological death, is something we'll do almost anything to avoid. This brings us to the practical question. How do you actually begin this process? Not in theory, but in the brutal reality of your daily life. How do you start dismantling the identities that have defined you? How do you wage this war against yourself without just creating new, more sophisticated forms of self-deception? This is where philosophy must become practice, where ideas must become lived experience. And this is where most people fail, not because they don't understand the concept, but because they're not willing to pay the price it demands. Self-overcoming isn't a single dramatic moment. It's a systematic dismantling of everything you've used to avoid confronting yourself. It's a daily practice of choosing discomfort over familiarity, uncertainty over security, becoming over being. Nietzsche understood that this required structure, not just inspiration. It required specific practices that would force you into confrontation with the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. The challenge is that your mind will fight this process with everything it has. It will create elaborate justifications for why you need to stay who you are. It will generate fear about what you'll lose. It will convince you that slow, comfortable change is more sustainable than radical transformation. And if you're not aware of these mechanisms, they'll sabotage every attempt you make to actually overcome yourself. So let's break down the actual method, not as a formula for success, but as a framework for destruction. These are the 4 pillars that create the conditions for self-overcoming. They're not meant to make you feel good, they're meant to break you open. First, systematic elimination of comfort narratives. Start identifying every story you tell yourself about who you are. Write them down. I'm an introvert. I'm not good with money. I'm a creative person. I'm damaged from my past. Every single identity marker you use to explain yourself. Then, for the next month, act directly against each one. If you identify as someone who needs a lot of alone time, force yourself into social situations daily. If you tell yourself you're not analytical, spend 2 hours every day working with numbers and data. The goal isn't to become the opposite, it's to prove to yourself that these identities are choices, not truths. You've been performing a character, and the performance can be stopped. Second, deliberate exposure to psychological discomfort. Most people organize their entire lives around avoiding feelings of inadequacy, shame, or uncertainty. Self-overcoming requires the opposite. It requires you to actively seek these feelings out. This means doing things you're terrible at in public. It means having conversations that expose your ignorance. It means putting yourself in situations where you have no idea what you're doing. Not occasionally, but systematically. The discomfort isn't a bug, it's the feature. It's the friction that wears down the false self. Third, creation of new daily rituals that contradict old patterns. Your daily routines are maintaining your current identity. They're the repeated behaviors that reinforce who you think you are. To overcome yourself, you need to design rituals that force you into a different way of being. If you've always been reactive, create a morning practice of 2 hours of deep focus before looking at any communications. If you've always been logical and controlled, spend 30 minutes daily doing something completely impulsive and unplanned. If you've always been agreeable, practice saying no to every request for a week. These aren't permanent changes, they're experiments in becoming something other than what you've been. Fourth, rigorous documentation of self-deception. Keep a daily journal, but not to track progress or celebrate wins. Use it to catch yourself in the act of self-deception. Write down every moment you notice yourself retreating into comfortable narratives. Every time you justify avoiding discomfort. Every time you choose the familiar over the unknown. Be brutally honest about the mechanisms you use to avoid actual change. This isn't about judgment, it's about awareness. You can't overcome what you can't see, and most of what's holding you back operates in the shadows of your awareness. Nietzsche himself practiced a version of this relentlessly. He walked for hours every day in the mountains, alone with his thoughts, refusing to let himself settle into comfortable philosophical positions. He wrote drafts and then destroyed them, refusing to let his ideas calcify into fixed positions. He moved constantly between different cities and climates, never allowing himself to become too settled, too comfortable, too identified with any particular place or way of being. This wasn't about productivity or optimization. This was about maintaining a state of perpetual becoming, refusing to solidify into a fixed self. He understood that the moment you stop moving, the moment you decide, this is who I am, you've already begun dying. Not physically, but psychologically. You've chosen the comfort of known identity over the vitality of constant transformation. But here's what most people miss. These practices will make you less functional in the short term. You'll become worse at things you were good at. You'll lose relationships that were built on your old identity. You'll feel more confused and less certain than you've ever felt. And this is exactly the point. You're not trying to improve your performance within the existing structure. You're trying to break the structure entirely. The people around you will notice something's wrong. They'll tell you you're going through a phase, that you're being reckless, that you should get back to being yourself. What they mean is, get back to being the version of you that I understand, that I can predict, that doesn't challenge me to question my own fixed identity. And this is where you'll face your first real test. Because maintaining your old self isn't just about your internal resistance. It's about all the external pressure to remain who people need you to be. You'll want to quit. You'll want to go back to the comfortable narratives. You'll convince yourself that this whole idea of self-overcoming is just nihilistic destruction without purpose. And maybe it is. Maybe Nietzsche was wrong. Maybe clinging to a stable identity is actually the wiser path. But if you're going to quit, at least be honest about why. Don't tell yourself it's because the method doesn't work. Admit that you're choosing comfort over transformation. Admit that you're not willing to pay the price that becoming requires. Because what comes next, if you continue, is the hardest part. It's the moment when all the old structures are gone, when you've successfully dismantled your familiar sense of self, but nothing new has emerged to replace it. You're standing in a void of your own making, with no map, no identity, no certainty about who you are or who you're becoming. And this is where most people break. This is where they frantically rebuild some version of the old self just to escape the unbearable feeling of being no one. There's a particular kind of silence that comes when you've successfully destroyed your old identity but haven't yet become anything new. It's not the peaceful silence of meditation or the quiet of a calm mind. It's the silence of complete psychological disorientation. You wake up in the morning and don't know who you are. The narratives you use to comfort yourself no longer work. The goals that used to motivate you feel hollow. The relationships that used to define you feel like performances you can't continue. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy stops being interesting and starts being terrifying. Because this void, this space between selves, is where the real test happens. Not the test of whether you can practice the method or follow the steps. The test of whether you can endure the absence of yourself without running back to the safety of known identity. And make no mistake, every fiber of your being will scream at you to run back. Your mind will generate the most convincing reasons to retreat. It will tell you that you've made a terrible mistake, that you were better off before, that this whole idea of self-overcoming is just philosophical masturbation with no real value. It will produce anxiety, depression, a sense of complete meaninglessness. And these aren't obstacles to the process. They are the process. This psychological suffering is what burns away the last attachments to who you were. You'll reach for your old coping mechanisms and find they no longer work. The distractions that used to numb you feel transparent and useless. The people who used to validate you can't reach you anymore because you're no longer speaking the same language. Even your own thoughts feel foreign, like they're coming from someone else. You become a stranger to yourself, and there's nowhere to hide from that strangeness. But if you can sit in this discomfort without retreating, without rebuilding, without creating new stories to replace the old ones, something begins to shift. It's subtle at first. You notice moments of clarity that don't come from thinking but from a deeper place. You find yourself acting in ways you can't explain or justify. You feel impulses that don't fit into any category of who you thought you were. These aren't random. They're the first movements of something new trying to emerge. Nietzsche wrote about this in Thus Spoke Zarathustra when he described the three metamorphoses of the spirit, from camel to lion to child. The camel bears the weight of old values. The lion destroys those values and creates freedom. But the child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a sacred yes to life. Most people never get past the lion stage. They learn to say no, to destroy, to question, but they never arrive at the creative innocence that comes after destruction. This phase, this void, is the territory between lion and child. You've learned to destroy, but you haven't yet learned to create from nothing. You're in the desert that Nietzsche described, the place where all values have died but new values haven't yet been born, and the desert doesn't care about your suffering. It doesn't reward you for getting this far. It just keeps stretching out in front of you, offering no guarantees about what lies on the other side. The pain you feel here isn't like other kinds of pain. It's not the pain of a broken bone or a broken heart. Those have clear causes and clear remedies. This is existential pain, the pain of confronting the groundlessness of your own existence, the pain of realizing that there is no essential self underneath all the identities you've worn. There's just this constant process of becoming, this endless flow of experience with no stable reference point to call me. And here's the cruel irony. You can't force your way through this stage. You can't use willpower or discipline or any of the tools that might have helped you get here. Those tools belong to the old self, the one who believed they could control their transformation. Now you have to learn a completely different skill, the skill of allowing, of not doing, of letting go so completely that even your attempts to let go are released. Some people spend years in this phase. Some people never leave it. They become permanent outsiders, unable to return to conventional identity, but unable to move forward into new creation. They're stuck in the destructive power of the lion, constantly tearing down but never building. They become cynical, bitter, convinced that all values are equally meaningless. This is the danger Nietzsche saw, that destruction becomes its own kind of addiction, its own kind of identity. But if you can move through this without getting stuck, without becoming identified with the destruction itself, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to feel a kind of lightness you've never experienced before, not the lightness of having no responsibilities, but the lightness of having no fixed self to defend. You begin to play with different ways of being, not as roles you're performing, but as genuine expressions of this moment's energy. You discover that without a fixed identity to protect, you can respond to life directly, immediately, without the constant internal commentary about what this means about who you are. Someone criticizes you, and instead of defending yourself or collapsing into shame, you simply hear the information and respond. You fail at something, and instead of reinforcing a narrative about your inadequacy, you just notice what happened and adjust. The drama of selfhood begins to fade, and what remains is something simpler, more direct, more alive. This is what Nietzsche meant by amor fati, the love of fate. Not a passive acceptance of whatever happens, but an active embrace of reality as it is, without the filter of what you wish it would be or what you think it should mean about you. You're no longer fighting with existence, trying to make it confirm your preferred identity. You're dancing with it, moving with it, becoming it. And in this dance, the question of who you are becomes irrelevant. There's just this flow of becoming, this constant transformation without a transformer. But to get here, you had to be willing to die. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but psychologically. You had to let every version of yourself that you've ever been collapse into nothing. You had to stand in that nothing without flinching, without rebuilding, without creating new stories about how enlightened you are for standing there. And most people, when they actually understand what this requires, choose to stay who they are. They choose the known suffering of limited identity over the unknown possibility of constant becoming. The transformation doesn't announce itself. There's no moment of awakening where suddenly everything makes sense. Instead, you realize one day that you've been living differently for weeks without noticing. You've been making decisions you wouldn't have made before, thinking thoughts that don't fit your old patterns, feeling emotions you don't have names for. And when you try to explain what's changed, you can't. Because the person who could explain it no longer exists. You walk into a room where people who knew you before are gathered. They look at you expectantly, waiting for you to be who they remember. But that person isn't available anymore. Not because you're trying to be different, but because the old patterns simply don't arise. The automatic responses, the familiar defenses, the predictable reactions, they're gone. And in their place is something more fluid, more responsive, less definable. Here's the strange irony. The people closest to you will often be the most disturbed by your transformation. They'll tell you that you've changed, but they'll say it like an accusation, not a celebration, because your change forces them to confront the possibility of their own. It challenges their belief that people are fundamentally fixed, that character is destiny, that who you are at 20 is who you'll be at 50. Your transformation is a mirror that shows them their own refusal to transform. They'll point out inconsistencies in your new behavior. They'll remind you of things you used to believe, values you used to hold, positions you used to take. And when you don't defend yourself, when you simply acknowledge that yes, you used to be that way and now you're not, they won't know what to do with you. They need you to either justify your change or apologize for it. When you do neither, when you simply embody the change without explanation, it creates a kind of cognitive dissonance they can't resolve. Some people will get angry. They'll accuse you of betraying who you really are, of going through a phase, of being influenced by the wrong ideas or people. What they're actually angry about is that you've proven that transformation is possible, and that possibility threatens the stories they tell themselves about why they can't change. Your freedom confronts them with their own chains. And rather than examine those chains, it's easier to convince themselves that you've made a terrible mistake. Others will try to pull you back through guilt. They'll remind you of who you used to be in ways that feel loving, but are actually attempts at control. You used to be so lighthearted? What happened? You used to care about these things, now you seem cold. The old you would never have done this. Each statement is an invitation to return to the cage they're comfortable with, the version of you that doesn't challenge their own stagnation. But here's what nobody tells you about the other side of self-overcoming. You don't need them to understand. You don't need their validation or approval or recognition. Not because you're above such things, but because the part of you that needed those things has been destroyed. You're not performing transformation for an audience. You're not trying to convince anyone that you've changed. You're simply living from a different center of gravity, one that doesn't require external confirmation. Nietzsche described this state as existing beyond good and evil. Not because morality doesn't matter, but because you're no longer dependent on moral categories to tell you who you are. You act from a more direct place, from an immediate response to life rather than from a set of rules about how someone like you should behave. This doesn't make you immoral. It makes you more genuinely responsive to what each moment actually requires, rather than what your identity says you should do. You discover a kind of solitude that isn't loneliness. You're alone in the sense that no one can fully understand the transformation you've undergone, but you're not isolated because you're more connected to life itself. The old connections were based on shared identities, shared stories, shared limitations. These new connections, when they form, are based on something more fundamental, a recognition of the same commitment to becoming, the same willingness to destroy and recreate, the same refusal to solidify into fixed form. People who've undergone real transformation recognize each other instantly. Not through what they say or what they believe, but through what they don't defend. Through their comfort with uncertainty, their lack of investment in being right, their ability to hold contradictions without resolution. There's a lightness to them that comes from not carrying the weight of a fixed identity. And when two people like this meet, no explanation is necessary. They simply see each other, but most of your life will still be spent among people who haven't undergone this process. And you'll watch them suffer in ways you used to suffer, clinging to identities that hurt them, defending beliefs that limit them, running from the very changes that would liberate them, and you won't be able to save them. You can't give them your transformation. They have to want it enough to pay the price themselves. All you can do is live in a way that shows it's possible, without preaching, without evangelizing, without needing them to change. You'll also notice that your relationship to your own past changes completely. The stories you use to tell about your life, the traumas, the victories, the defining moments, lose their power over you, not because you've forgotten them or healed from them in some conventional sense, but because you're no longer building an identity around them. They become just things that happened, no more or less significant than anything else. The narrative self that needed those stories to make sense of who you are has dissolved. This is perhaps the strangest aspect of self-overcoming. You become someone without a fixed history. You have memories, of course, but they don't add up to a coherent story about who you've always been. Each moment becomes fresh again, uncontaminated by the weight of accumulated identity. You can respond to a situation without the burden of, "This is what someone with my history would do." You're free to surprise yourself constantly because there's no established pattern you're trying to maintain. Nietzsche called this the eternal return, the idea that you would willingly live this exact life again and again, infinitely. It sounds like a metaphysical claim, but it's actually a psychological test. Have you overcome your resentment toward your own existence so completely that you would choose it all again? When you've truly overcome yourself, the answer becomes yes. Not because every moment has been pleasant, but because you're no longer at war with what is. But let's be clear about what this transformation actually means for how you live. Because this isn't about achieving some permanent state of enlightenment where you float above human concerns. You still have to navigate the same world, deal with the same practical realities, engage with people who are still operating from fixed identities. The difference is in how you move through it all. Self-overcoming, in Nietzsche's vision, is not an escape from life, but a deeper engagement with it. You're not transcending the human condition. You're embracing it more fully by refusing to hide behind comfortable illusions about who you are. You're choosing the difficulty of constant becoming over the ease of static being. And this choice has to be made again and again, every single day. There's no permanent victory, no point at which you can declare yourself fully overcome. This is the alchemical process Nietzsche understood better than almost anyone. You take the base materials of your life, your suffering, your limitations, your failures, your shame, and instead of trying to transcend them or get rid of them, you transmute them, not into gold in the literal sense, but into fuel for your becoming. Every wound becomes a source of wisdom. Every limitation becomes a boundary to push against. Every failure becomes information about what wants to emerge. He saw that most people approach their pain as something to be eliminated, their weaknesses as things to be fixed, their past as something to be redeemed. But self-overcoming requires a completely different relationship to all of this. You don't fix yourself, you use yourself as raw material. You don't become better, you become other. You don't resolve your contradictions, you intensify them until something new emerges from the tension. This is what Nietzsche meant by true freedom. Not the freedom to choose between existing options, but the freedom to become something that doesn't yet exist. Not the freedom from constraints, but the freedom to create yourself within and through those constraints. Not the freedom to be whoever you want, but the freedom to destroy whoever you've been and allow something unknown to take its place. The person who achieves this isn't recognizable by conventional standards of success. They might not be wealthy or famous or accomplished in any traditional sense, but they have something that no achievement can provide. They're completely alive. They haven't traded vitality for security, presence for comfort, becoming for being. They move through life with an intensity that makes others uncomfortable because it reflects back their own dampened aliveness. They don't need to prove anything because they have nothing to defend. They don't need to convince anyone because they're not performing for an audience. They don't need to be understood because their sense of self doesn't depend on external validation. This isn't arrogance. It's the natural result of having destroyed the part of yourself that needs these things. And in that destruction, what emerges is something more genuinely powerful than any constructed confidence or self-esteem. You become someone who can fail without being a failure, succeed without being a success, suffer without being a victim, create without being an artist. Because none of these categories stick to you anymore. They're just temporary descriptions of what's happening in this moment, not permanent identities you're trying to maintain or achieve. You're in constant motion, constant flux, constant becoming. And this motion is what it means to be fully alive. This is not the end of anything. This is barely the beginning. Because once you've tasted this kind of freedom, once you've experienced what it means to live without the weight of a fixed self, you can't unknow it. You can't go back to the comfortable prison of stable identity. You can only continue forward into stranger and stranger territories of your own becoming, with no map, no guarantee, no certainty about where you'll end up. What version of yourself are you protecting by refusing to change? What identity have you built your entire life around that's actually preventing you from becoming who you could be? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're invitations to honest self-examination. You can answer them in the comments, or you can sit with them in silence. But don't ignore them, because the answers will reveal whether you're actually committed to transformation or just interested in the idea of it. Nietzsche believed that most people would choose the comfortable lie of stable identity over the terrifying truth of constant becoming. He believed that genuine self-overcoming would always be the path of the few, not because it requires special talent, but because it requires a kind of courage most people will never access. The courage to destroy yourself repeatedly, to stand in the void without rebuilding, to become someone you cannot predict or control. If this video has shaken something loose in how you understand yourself, or if it's challenged you to question the identities you've been defending, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the human psyche through Nietzsche's radical philosophy. Until the next video.